From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, May 15th. Oregon lawmakers have been hard at work for months, debating policies, passing bills, and hammering out legislation that affects millions of residents. But they've done that without knowing how much money they have to spend on any of this. That changed this week, and it's sort of a mixed bag. Today, we're going to explain what it all means. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, you're speaking to us from the OPB Salem office right now.
Yes.
I'm curious, in your job, some days are more significant than others, and the revenue forecast is one of those days. Earlier this week that dropped. Can you explain why?
Yeah. The revenue forecast is one of them, but more specifically, the revenue forecast delivered in May of odd years is really one of them. That's because the legislature sets a 2-year budget and typically passes that budget in June of odd years, meaning we are getting ready to pass one next month, or at least the legislature is. But in order to figure out what it can pay for, right? The legislature needs to have some sense of what it has to spend. And the revenue forecast delivered, as I say, in May of odd years is essentially the final answer to that question. It is the number lawmakers use to pass what is theoretically a balanced budget. I say theoretically because it's impossible really to predict how much money the state is going to bring in. So these are always wrong to one degree or another, but still very, very crucial.
So this is fascinating stuff for nerds like us and Politics Now listeners. And we've talked about it a lot before, but can you explain a bit more just how challenging it is to predict revenue 2 years from now? Like you were saying, how is that even done?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more art than science, I would say. What the state economists do is start with forecasts for how the national economy is expected to perform. I think they contract out for these forecasts from big national folks. And then they meet with a wide variety of, industry experts, other economists, a lot of people who think about Oregon's economy and try to figure out how that national economic picture is likely to overlay on this state, right? So, for instance, Oregon is a very highly trade-dependent state. We hear that a lot. Mm-hmm. How do tariffs impact us uniquely? That is the sort of thing that the state economists are trying to work out, puzzle through. And at the end of that, it typically takes, I think, around a month. They come out with this prediction. But as you say, Alex, and I certainly agree, predicting 2 years into the future is impossible. Oregon is actually one of a minority of states that use a 2-year budget. It is one thing that makes the job of state economists particularly daunting. I think some would say particularly miserable.
All of this brings us to Wednesday's grand reveal. You reported that state lawmakers had been bracing for a reduced revenue forecast. Is that what happened?
It is, yes. I would say the big takeaway from the forecast, or at least one of them, is that lawmakers have about $500 million less than they'd been expecting for the next budget up until this forecast dropped. Mm-hmm. And why that is, we were told, is that economic growth has really slowed in the first few months of President Donald Trump's administration. The national outlook had expected GDP growth of around 2% in 2025. Now it's looking like it might be less than half of that, about 0.8%. And that means that economists had to revisit, basic assumptions about how much Oregon would bring in income taxes, which is by far our main reliance for the state budget. Mm-hmm. They concluded, as I mentioned, it would be quite a bit less than previously thought, about $500 million. And you're right, many legislators did anticipate something like this would emerge. But the other big takeaway of this revenue forecast is that absolutely nothing is certain. Things could wind up far worse. They could wind up being better. One state economist, whose name is Michael Kennedy, said yesterday that he's been doing these forecasts for around 20 years. That means he's done 10 of these all-important odd-year May forecasts. And he said this one really stands out.
At the time of the May forecast, I can't remember more tumultuous circumstances just going into producing this particular forecast. I mean, we've had a pandemic, a Great Recession, but those happened within the biennium, not at the point in time when you're trying to forecast 2 years ahead.
So, as they are doing this, things are swirling around on the national stage and no one knows what is coming. Obviously not the kind of thing that offers the most confidence that this forecast will pan out, but here we are. They had to give a number.
Well, you mentioned the national stage. Let's zoom out a little bit to that. Our new president has wasted no time in tinkering with the way our country operates or spends money, and a lot of that has impacted Oregon. What new federal policies or public stances are really affecting Oregon's economy? I mean, you mentioned tariffs. I imagine that's one of them, but what else is kind of part of the conversation?
No, I mean, I think the big one, at least the one that the state economists talked about most, was really tariffs. As I
Sure.
said, we are one of the most trade dependent states in the nation. We really stand to be hurt when trade wars escalate. In fact, the state economists would say that when Trump was first in office and began some trade wars, some really robust growth in the Oregon economy came to a halt because of that. And so we stand at a time when we're not necessarily growing really fast to be especially hurt this time. The state's chief economist, his name is Carl Riccadonna. Riccadonna said that it seemed some of the chaos from the tariffs has settled down a bit. A lot of them have been delayed. There have been little deals here and there and new announcements. But he was also clear that could change quickly with a tweet. He said it could change in a moment. And the lack of certainty brought on by these is one of the things that really appears to be hampering the business climate, slowing the economy. So that is the biggie. But I obviously more than tariffs are happening, right? We have seen immigration crackdowns that could impact the economy. We've seen mass federal layoffs by this U.S. DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, including in Oregon. All that could pose a challenge too, though we should note, Riccadonna did say federal layoffs in Oregon hadn't really seemed to elevate unemployment claims that we've seen. In fact, it just looks like a normal year right now. So for all we've heard about that, it hasn't shown up at least yet in some of the state data.
Interesting. So if I have this right, Oregon is still getting millions more than anticipated, at least compared to 3 months ago, but not as much more. Why is this a big deal, or is this a big deal at all?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have it right. If we are looking at this big picture, the state will have around $2 billion more in discretionary money to spend for the next budget than it did in the current 2-year budget. So around $39.3 billion all told. What we learned yesterday is that the number is now $500 million lower than economists had been expecting because of the reasons we've been talking about. And it does matter. Oregon is not going to see, at least from everything we can tell, right, a bloodbath budget because of this. Actually, under a pretty high level budget framework Democrats released in March, the state should have enough money to fund the vast majority of its current services, put money into our reserve funds, and still have something like, if my math is right, $500 million or so to spend on new investments. So this is not a dire outlook just yet. But what it does do is it really influences the budget conversation and what is possible. It probably dooms a lot of bills, right? Because many bills in the session have fiscals attached to them. That's a way of saying they would cost the state some amount of money, and therefore they need to go before the budget committee. And with this smaller pool of money available than was expected, lawmakers are going to have to ditch probably a lot of those. That might even include some major investments that Governor Tina Kotek has proposed for homelessness, healthcare, education. But the aperture of what is possible has grown more narrow because of this forecast.
So you mentioned Carl Riccadonna earlier. He's kind of he's leading all these conversations. He's the state's new chief economist. A bit of a new era with him at the helm. How is he predicting things differently than his predecessor?
Yeah, I will be honest, I don't understand it all. But yes, he came into his position last year, almost immediately announced he was going to change some things about how Oregon conducts these forecasts. He believed that his predecessor, Mark McMullen, wasn't accurately or adequately factoring the state's well-known kicker tax rebate into his forecast. And that had, via whatever, I mean, again, I am not fully grasping it, but for whatever reason that had caused a sort of vicious cycle within the forecast that only led to more kicker rebates. So Riccadonna says he's corrected that. And if that's true, that may be good. Maybe we see the kicker less, but it also poses a different kind of risk to the state because Riccadonna says he's just as likely to overestimate how much money we're going to have as he is to underestimate. And overestimating often leads to budget cuts down the line. Underestimating is what leads to the kicker. So we've seen a lot of kickers. We can talk about that, but it's just a different dynamic these days.
So let's talk about the kicker. It's pretty surprising that we've actually made it this far in the conversation without bringing it up yet. Can you remind folks just briefly what it is and what this forecast, this week means for the kicker rebate that we can expect next year?
Yes. So the kicker is this unique Oregon policy that sends a refund back to taxpayers whenever the state gets at least 2% more in personal income tax revenue than lawmakers budgeted for. The kicker is actually based on the May revenue forecast, which means that if the state brings in 2% or more above that personal income tax Riccadonna predicted this week, that's where the number is set. We will have a kicker coming. More immediately, though, the forecast did have an impact on a kicker we know taxpayers will receive next year. Because the state is expecting less in tax revenue in the current biennium, it brought the kicker down a bit. Oregon is still, though, going to see, it sounds like, a $1.63 billion tax rebate. That's not a small amount. Obviously, that would be the fourth largest kicker in state history.
So how is all of this landing politically? Republicans have really sort of adopted the federal stance in Oregon more strongly, maybe this session, that Oregon's spending is out of control.
Yep.
Where are the GOP leaders landing on this revenue forecast?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting on some of it. There has been a lot of finger pointing, I would say, in the Capitol this week around the revenue forecast since yesterday. I think Republicans reacted in a couple ways. The first was to argue that any slowing down of the state economy that's reflected in this forecast wasn't President Trump's problem at all. They would argue it's because of overly onerous policies that Democrats have passed over the years, including business regulation, land use regulation, taxes. You're probably familiar with many of those arguments. Republicans say that Democrats could juice the economy on their own if they wanted by rolling back those. I will say, what we heard from state economists was heavily focused on the federal policy and not local Democratic policies. So the other thing they've said is what you mentioned, is that this forecast is not the horror show that some Democrats are trying to suggest. Republicans point out the state is expected to have a lot more money next budget than the current budget. They have really renewed calls on Democrats to back off ideas for proposing taxes. There's a big proposal for raising billions for roads and bridges. Back off that, because the state has plenty of money and Republicans say we should make do with what we've got.
So a lot of finger pointing at Democrats. How are they responding, and how are they saying this will affect, the budget writing process, different projects or priorities that they're prioritizing this session? What are you hearing?
Yeah. I mean, so I spoke with a number of lawmakers about this yesterday. I don't think, at least the folks I talked to, it wasn't super clear at this point. As of Wednesday, there was not, any sort of grand official word about what policies were no longer feasible or how many bills might have to die or anything like that. But as I say, it's simple math that plenty of proposals out there are going to die just because there's less available money. The other thing we do also probably want to talk about, though, Alex, is more about this uncertainty, right? This is a snapshot in time. And as we heard Kennedy say, things are tumultuous. That means things very well may change, as we've said. If, for instance, the country slips into a recession, lawmakers would very likely need to come back in for a special session to adjust the budget, meet those new circumstances, figure out where we are, right? And the other big question mark, we've really only here been talking about general fund money, what the state reaps from its tax code, right? But there's a huge question around federal funding. We've seen this week congressional Republicans moving forward with big cuts to Medicaid. Those would likely impact what kinds of services the state can offer poor people, right? In terms of Medicaid, there's also cuts to SNAP or food assistance that are being contemplated. So that is another big question mark about, if we lose all these federal resources, is the state going to be able to step in and try to replace at least some of the billions of dollars that might be at stake? House Speaker Julie Fahey spoke a little bit about this in a meeting with reporters earlier this week.
If millions of Americans are going to lose access to health care, states are not set up to backfill those resources. Every state, not just Oregon, will be hurt significantly by those cuts. And so in Oregon, we'll have to figure out how do we respond. But I expect that will not become clear before the end of session.
So, I've said uncertainty too many times on this podcast already. I just can't really drive the point home enough. There's just so many questions on the horizon.
I mean, and I will note too, there's another question is that, I cover City of Portland politics, and the city's budget relies heavily on funding coming from the state. So it's kind of this trickle down from the feds to the state to the city. And, I know that Mayor Keith Wilson is certainly watching to see if kind of his hopeful asks to the state legislature will actually come through to fund, homelessness programs and other programs in Portland in the future.
There's a $5 million ask, if I'm right, for some of his homeless initiative. Like, where does that sit now that we're $500 million later?
Yeah.
It's a big question. I'm sure he's asking it, or his folks are.
Yeah. Well, Dirk, before we go, let's pivot. I want to touch on one other fairly major event that happened last week. Oregon's former Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan, went before the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. This is an event that was about 2 years in the making, actually. So Fagan appeared before this ethics commission to face a number of allegations against her. A couple of those, I would say, are fairly minor in the grand scheme. That this notion that she'd received travel reimbursement from the state that was a little more than she was entitled to. The far more interesting allegations got to the reason that Fagan resigned in 2023. So just to remind folks, Fagan was, a rising star, Democratic politics, Secretary of State. When Willamette Week reported that she had, while she was Secretary of State, taken on a lucrative side gig, working for a cannabis company. That came at the same time the agency she controlled. I mean, the Secretary of State's auditing office was preparing an audit, essentially bashing the state for regulating cannabis companies too harshly. So obviously a bad look. The Ethics Commission ultimately found she'd used her public office for private gain, essentially getting that lucrative side gig. She's denied that, but Fagan has, stayed out of the public eye since resigning over this. She appeared before the Ethics Commission in Salem last week, and the commission had essentially proposed initially settling the case against her for $1,600, all of it, the reimbursement stuff and this idea that she'd peddled her public office for private gain. Our colleague Lauren Dake was there. Here is some of what Fagan told the commission.
For most of 2023, I have imagined the chance to sit here and defend myself. And then I spent the last 2 years in bittersweet reflection on my time in politics, and now I'm sitting here. And I know that my actions were indefensible. Embarrassing mistakes, bad judgment, and I'm sorry.
I think it was pretty striking because, she'd been out of the public eye, but had really, indicated she felt she'd done nothing wrong. And that was not the message that she offered the Ethics Commission. She told commissioners she would accept any fine that they wanted to levy against her. She just wanted this done with. And actually, the commission decided that this $1,600 settlement wasn't good enough. They rejected that proposal. Did some more discussions and ultimately assessed a $3,600 fine against Fagan. Assuming she pays that, I have no reason to believe she wouldn't. That likely closes the book on this. There's not much more out there on this whole sort of sordid affair. So the Fagan Chronicle. I don't
saga.
know. The saga may be coming to a close.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly been following that for a while here, podcast. Well, we'll leave it there for this week. Dirk, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. In these uncertain times, we are certain that you have questions about local politics. Maybe we can answer them. We would love to hear from you. Email us at opbpoliticsnow@opb.org. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.